At 0842, on a humid morning, February 4th, 1943, Captain Robert "Rob" Miller pressed himself against the shattered concrete of a defensive position his unit had seized days earlier. His focus was locked through a specialized sight on a dense cluster of mangrove trees, roughly 200 meters distant. For more than a month, his superior officers had scoffed at the custom hunting rifle he insisted on carrying. At 28, Miller was a former regional sharpshooting title holder from Ohio, yet in this theater of war, his official tally remained blank. The enemy had entrenched a team of 8 skilled marksmen within the labyrinthine root systems of the coastal swamps. Over a brutal 96-hour period, these hidden shooters had incapacitated 16 soldiers from Miller's battalion, the 141st Infantry. His direct commander had previously ordered him to stow the civilian weapon and use standard-issue arms. Miller had quietly disobeyed. The 141st had taken over from Marine elements on the island in mid-December. While the Marines had secured the critical airstrip after months of fierce combat, they had been unable to dislodge the enemy from the dense jungle to the west of the main river. The key high ground, a rugged peak the enemy called the Boar's Head, was a formidable stronghold.
Miller's battalion launched their assault on December 22nd. The fighting was relentless, dragging on for 18 days. They suffered significant casualties before finally securing the enemy's positions on the western face of the ridge on January 5th. Throughout that entire grueling engagement, Miller had not fired his personal weapon a single time. The terrain around what the maps designated as Sector Delta was a different kind of battlefield. It was not a place of fixed fortifications, but a shadowy domain where enemy soldiers who had fallen back from the main airstrip had melted into the immense ancient trees. Some of these soldiers were marksmen equipped with scoped rifles. They possessed an intimate knowledge of the jungle and the discipline to wait endlessly for a target. On February 1st, a concealed shooter killed Private First Class Evans as he collected water from a stream. The next day, another marksman eliminated 2 soldiers from K Company during a reconnaissance patrol. On February 3rd, 3 more men were lost. One was hit in the chest by a round that came from a tree the patrol had passed minutes before. The battalion commander summoned Miller that evening. The enemy snipers were inflicting losses at a rate that rivaled tropical diseases. He needed a solution and demanded to know if the custom-crafted rifle could actually deliver results.
Miller outlined his background: winner of the Ohio Long Range Championship at 1,000 yards in 1938, the youngest to ever claim the title at 22. He detailed the rifle's capabilities, explaining its consistent accuracy. The commander gave him until the following dawn to prove its worth. That night, Miller meticulously serviced his firearm. The weapon had been coated in preservative grease for its sea voyage. He cleaned it again, checked the scope alignment, and loaded 5 rounds of his own .30-06 hunting ammunition, which used the same cartridge as the standard military rifle. At first light on February 4th, Miller moved into the captured enemy position. It overlooked the tangled groves of Sector Delta. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy marksmen operated from the largest trees in the area. Some of these mangroves stood over 80 feet tall, their trunks massive. A patient man could climb one before sunrise and remain utterly concealed for the entire day. Miller worked alone, without a spotter or radio operator, carrying only his rifle, water, and 60 rounds of ammunition. He settled in and began the slow, methodical process of scanning the canopy through his scope.
The optic provided modest magnification, but it was sufficient to detect slight movements invisible to the naked eye. The jungle was a cacophony of natural sounds, but Miller had trained himself to filter out the noise and concentrate on visual cues. He scanned each tree methodically. At 0842, he saw it, a slight, unnatural shift of a branch high up in a mangrove, approximately 220 yards away. There was no wind. He watched, and the branch moved again. Then he discerned the form, a figure in dark clothing, positioned where several large branches converged. The enemy marksman was facing the trail Miller's battalion used for resupply. Miller made a slight adjustment to his scope for the gentle breeze. He controlled his breathing. The rifle's trigger was precision-made, breaking cleanly. He squeezed. The shot echoed through the stillness. At 220 yards, the enemy soldier jerked and then fell, his body crashing down through the layers of foliage before hitting the ground. Miller cycled the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. He kept his scope on the tree, waiting. If the downed man was the shooter, his spotter would be close by. He began scanning the surrounding trees.
At 09:11, he located the second target in a different tree, about 50 yards north of the first. This soldier was lower, perhaps 40 feet up, and was hurriedly descending the trunk. He had heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. Miller led the moving target slightly and fired. The second enemy soldier fell backward from the tree, his weapon clattering down behind him. 2 shots, 2 confirmed eliminations. Miller reloaded, his hand steady. This was no different from competition shooting, save for the critical fact that the targets could return fire. Later that morning, at 11:05, an enemy round struck a sandbag mere inches from Miller's head, spraying dirt and fragments into his face. He immediately rolled to a new position. The shot had originated from the southwest. He waited several minutes before cautiously returning to his scope. The shooter would have likely moved after firing. Miller located him at 11:24, concealed in the same cluster of trees but having shifted to a different branch, a fatal error. Miller aligned the crosshairs and fired a third time. The soldier fell silently. By midday, Miller had neutralized 5 enemy marksmen. The attitude within the battalion towards his rifle began to shift from mockery to awe. The enemy adapted after the 5th engagement. They ceased all movement during daylight hours. Miller spent the afternoon scanning the dense canopy, but saw no further activity. At 1600 hours, he returned to the battalion command post. Captain Reynolds, his company commander, was waiting. The previous mockery in his voice was gone, replaced by a firm directive for Miller to resume his mission at first light the next day. February 5th dawned with a torrential downpour. The heavy tropical rain turned the ground into a quagmire and reduced visibility to less than 100 meters. Miller remained in his sheltered position, waiting for a break in the weather. The rain finally slackened around 08:30, and by 09, visibility had improved enough to continue his work. He identified the first marksman of the day at 09:55. This soldier had used the sound-muffling rain to climb into a new position in a tree nearly 270 yards out, a longer range than the previous day's engagements, indicating the enemy was learning to respect his capabilities. Miller adjusted his aim for the increased distance and fired. The target fell.
This 6th elimination prompted an unexpected retaliation. Shortly after 10:30, enemy mortar fire began landing in the vicinity of Miller's position. They had triangulated his general location, likely from the sound or muzzle flash of his rifle. The first rounds fell 40 meters short. The second volley landed 20 meters short. Realizing the next salvo would be direct, Miller grabbed his gear and sprinted north along the tree line, diving into a water-filled shell crater. Moments later, his previous position was obliterated in a series of concussive blasts. He relocated to a new spot, a large fallen log situated about 100 meters north of the destroyed bunker. It provided adequate cover and a clear field of view into the groves. He settled in and resumed his vigil. The enemy, now fully aware of his presence, sent more marksmen. The nature of the mission had changed. It was no longer a one-sided hunt, but a deadly duel. At 14:50, he engaged and neutralized his 7th target. At 16:05, he eliminated an 8th, a marksman positioned nearly 90 feet high on a banyan tree, whose silhouette was exposed against the light of the late afternoon sky.
At 1700 hours, a runner arrived with orders for Miller to return to headquarters. Captain Reynolds demanded a full report. Miller confirmed 8 enemy marksmen neutralized over 2 days. He had fired 14 rounds, resulting in 8 hits and 6 misses, though some misses were suppressing shots. Reynolds formally assigned him to continue his specialized operations starting at dawn on February 6th. That evening, Miller cleaned his rifle and assessed the situation. The original intelligence reported 8 enemy marksmen. 8 were now confirmed eliminated. However, he suspected the most skilled and cautious ones, those who had survived the initial engagements, still remained, and they now knew his methods and his weapon. He loaded 5 fresh rounds and attempted to sleep, but rest was fleeting. He spent much of the night awake, his rifle across his lap, listening to the jungle and the distant rumble of artillery.
Before dawn on February 6th, another heavy rain began, delaying the morning's operations. Miller used the poor visibility as cover to move to a completely new position, one the enemy would not anticipate. He chose a spot 70 meters south of his original bunker, a cluster of large coral rocks that had previously been used as a machine gun nest. It offered excellent cover and overlapping fields of fire. The rain slowed to a drizzle around 0750. Miller began his systematic scan. At 0832, he spotted a potential target, a soldier positioned unusually low, only about 30 feet up in a palm tree, roughly 180 yards away. Most marksmen preferred higher vantage points. This felt wrong, too exposed. Miller suspected a trap. He held his fire and instead scanned the surrounding trees, looking for the real threat. After 11 minutes of intense searching, he found him, a well-concealed marksman in a banyan tree 80 meters northwest of the palm, positioned over 80 feet high, with a perfect line of sight covering Miller's previous position at the fallen log. He was the bait layer, waiting for Miller to take the obvious shot.
Miller devised a counter-strategy. He would use their trap against them. He aimed at the decoy in the palm tree, adjusted for the mild crosswind, and fired. The soldier in the palm slumped and fell. Immediately, without pausing to observe the result, Miller swung his rifle and scope toward the hidden marksman in the banyan tree. As he anticipated, the sound of the shot caused the hidden marksman to shift his position slightly to locate the source. In that moment of movement, Miller fired his second shot. The soldier in the banyan tree fell. 2 shots, 2 kills, and he had outmaneuvered their tactic. But he had also revealed his new position. He gathered his equipment and hastily retreated eastward, dropping into a muddy drainage ditch. Seconds later, sustained machine gun fire raked the coral rocks he had just vacated. The enemy had indeed been watching. He waited, then relocated again to a water-filled shell crater 100 meters further east. He was now down to his final 3 targets. The last one, he knew, would be the most dangerous, the most experienced, who had now studied Miller's patterns for 3 days.
From his new position in the water-filled crater, Miller continued his methodical search. He understood the remaining adversary would not make elementary mistakes. At 0955, a subtle movement at the edge of the tree line, not in the canopy but on the ground, caught his sharp eye. The final marksman was not in the trees at all. He was using the thick undergrowth for cover, moving low and slow, parallel to Miller's last known position. He was hunting the hunter, working his way toward the coral rocks. Miller remained perfectly still, submerged up to his chest in the murky water. The angle was poor. The crater's rim blocked a clear shot. He waited with immense patience, knowing any movement would betray his location. The enemy soldier eventually reached the rocks and took up a position, scanning eastward, the direction Miller had previously fled. His back was now turned to Miller's actual location, a mere 35 meters away. It was a clear shot. Yet Miller hesitated. This felt too easy. An experienced operator wouldn't expose himself so blatantly. Shifting his focus, Miller carefully scanned the area behind the rocks. His instinct proved correct. A second enemy soldier was concealed 65 meters away, hidden behind a fallen log. His rifle trained on the drainage ditch, exactly where Miller should have been hiding. It was a coordinated pincer tactic. The man in the rocks was the bait. Miller now faced two targets. He couldn't engage both quickly enough with his bolt-action rifle. He needed a new plan. He chose to wait. He sank deeper into the water, leaving only his eyes and the top of his head above the surface, his rifle held vertically to keep the barrel dry. Minutes passed. Growing impatient, the soldier in the rocks finally stood and signaled to his partner. Believing Miller had retreated further east, they both began moving in that direction, sweeping the area with their backs now turned to his crater. As they passed his position, Miller rose silently from the water. He fired twice in rapid succession. The first shot struck the soldier at the rocks. He worked the bolt, swung, and fired again, dropping the second soldier behind the log before he could return fire. The immediate threat was neutralized.
As Miller retrieved his spent cartridge cases, the sound of foreign voices echoed from the tree line. A group of enemy infantry, at least 6 soldiers, was advancing quickly toward the location of the 2 fallen marksmen. This was a recovery team, or a patrol. Miller dropped back into the crater. The voices grew closer, discussing the scene. Then they fell silent. They had discovered his boot prints leading from the rocks to the water-filled crater. Miller had 5 rounds left in his rifle. The odds were against him. The enemy squad began moving directly toward his hiding place. At 10:31, a soldier appeared at the crater's rim, looking down directly at Miller. Their eyes met. Miller fired from the water. The soldier fell back. He cycled the bolt, rose, and engaged 2 more soldiers who had reached the rim, firing twice in quick succession. 3 rounds remained. He could hear shouting and movement as the remaining enemy soldiers flanked his position. Realizing he was about to be surrounded, Miller made a break for it. He scrambled out of the crater and sprinted north through the dense jungle. Enemy rifle fire cracking around him, bullets snapping past his head and tearing into the foliage. After a frantic 90-second dash, he dove into another, drier shell crater. He listened intently. The pursuit had stopped. The enemy squad was likely regrouping around their casualties. Miller checked his rifle. It was caked in mud and water. He had only 2 rounds left, and his spare ammunition was back in his pack near the first crater. Cautiously, he began moving northeast toward friendly lines, using the terrain for cover. He reached the American perimeter at 11:15 and was challenged by a sentry before being escorted to headquarters.
At the command post, Captain Reynolds debriefed him. Miller reported 11 enemy marksmen eliminated over 3 days, using 12 rounds for those specific engagements. He then detailed the firefight with the infantry squad, accounting for 3 more hits with 5 rounds fired. He was down to his last 2 cartridges. Reynolds ordered him to stand down for the next day. The battalion was shifting its focus eastward as enemy forces on the island were beginning a general withdrawal. Later that afternoon, Miller was summoned to see the regimental commander, Colonel Hayes. To his surprise, he was not reprimanded but given a new mission: to form and train a specialized marksmanship unit. The regiment had 14 scoped Springfield rifles left behind by the Marines. Hayes had 40 men who had qualified as expert riflemen before deployment. Miller's condition for accepting the role was to keep his personal rifle. The request was approved. Training for the new sniper section began 4 days later at a makeshift range east of the main airstrip. Miller's new command consisted of 40 men, all expert marksmen on paper,
but untested in combat. He divided them into two-man teams, a shooter and a spotter. The spotter's role was to locate targets and provide security. Miller drilled them in the fundamentals: breath control, trigger squeeze, and reading wind in the chaotic jungle environment. The heavy-scoped Springfield rifles were less maneuverable than standard-issue weapons, so Miller taught his teams to use natural supports: logs, rocks, anything to create a stable firing platform. After 3 days of intensive training, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. On February 11th, Miller took 4 of the best teams into the field for their first live operation. Their objective was to clear enemy stragglers from an area west of the main river. Paired with a spotter named Corporal Jenkins, Miller set up an overwatch position on a ridge overlooking a known supply trail.
The mission was a decisive success. At 07:20, an enemy soldier appeared on the trail. Jenkins confirmed the target, and Miller engaged with a single shot. Over the next 6 hours, his team engaged 8 more enemy soldiers, achieving 7 confirmed hits. The other 3 teams reported similar results. By day's end, the section had accounted for 23 enemy casualties, with 0 friendly losses. This new tactic of precision fire proved devastatingly effective. Over the following week, Miller's sniper section continued its operations, systematically disrupting enemy movements. By February 18th, the section had tallied over 70 confirmed eliminations. The enemy's withdrawal was accelerating, with ships attempting nighttime evacuations from the western tip of the island. Miller's teams were tasked with interdicting the retreat routes, eliminating enemy soldiers covering the withdrawal.
On February 16th, during an operation near a winding river, Miller's luck ran out. An enemy rifleman, hidden in dense foliage, fired a single shot that struck Miller in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around. Jenkins immediately dragged him to cover and called for a medic. The wound was serious, but not life-threatening. The bullet had passed through muscle without striking bone or major arteries. Miller was evacuated to a field hospital near the airstrip. As he recovered over the next 2 weeks, the enemy completed their evacuation from the island. American forces reached the Western Cape on February 19th, finding it abandoned. The campaign was officially over. Miller's sniper section was formally recognized for its contributions. Colonel Hayes put Miller in for a decoration for his leadership and earlier actions.
While still convalescing, Miller received new orders. The war effort needed officers with his unique experience in jungle warfare and long-range marksmanship for a new classified mission in the China-Burma-India theater. He volunteered. By mid-March, he was on a transport ship heading west, his personal rifle securely stored in the hold. He knew little of the new assignment, only that it involved long-range patrols behind enemy lines, a task where a man with a precision rifle could be invaluable. The ship arrived in India on April 10th. Miller and a group of other selected officers were briefed on their assignment. They were to join a new, experimental, long-range penetration unit. The unit, which would later become famously known as Merrill's Marauders, was designed to operate deep behind Japanese lines for months at a time, without traditional supply lines, living off the land and captured equipment. Training in central India was grueling, focused on survival, mobility, and engaging superior forces with minimal support. The terrain was different, but the core principles of jungle marksmanship remained. Miller adapted his equipment for the arduous mission ahead, even lightening his rifle by replacing the stock and optic to save precious ounces. The Marauders entered Burma in late February 1944. Their mission was to march hundreds of miles through impossibly rugged terrain to capture a critical airfield. The march was a brutal test of endurance. Men succumbed to disease, exhaustion, and enemy ambushes.
Miller used his rifle only a handful of times during the entire campaign, engaging specific targets at long range: an officer at a river crossing, a machine gun crew, an enemy sniper. Each time, it was a single decisive shot before immediate relocation. The nature of the warfare had changed. Most engagements were sudden, close-range ambushes, where his scoped rifle was of limited use. He realized that while his weapon was a superb precision instrument, the future of infantry combat lay in semi-automatic arms.
The campaign to capture the critical airfield stretched over 3 brutal months. The Marauders covered over 700 miles of some of the most treacherous terrain in the world, battling not only the enemy, but also rampant disease and starvation. By the time the airfield was secured in late May 1944, the unit was combat ineffective, decimated by casualties and illness. Miller survived the ordeal, but his custom rifle saw limited use, confirming his belief that warfare was evolving away from specialized individual weapons toward standardized semi-automatic arms for the masses. Following the Burma campaign, Miller was evacuated with the rest of the shattered Marauders. The unit was disbanded, and he was reassigned to training duties back in the United States in July 1944. Promoted to captain, he was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he instructed infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics, imparting the hard-won lessons from the jungle. His trusted rifle, which had accounted for over a dozen confirmed enemy engagements, now resided in a footlocker, a relic of a fading era of soldiering.
After the war ended, Miller was discharged in early 1947 with the rank of lieutenant colonel and several decorations for valor. He returned to civilian life and, utilizing the GI Bill, enrolled at a prestigious university, studying political science. His post-war career was academic and diplomatic. He spent years in East Africa conducting research before eventually joining a Foreign Affairs Institute in Washington, D.C. as a lecturer and consultant. Throughout this period, he rarely spoke of his combat experiences. The memories of Point Cruz and the Burmese jungle remained private. In 1947, he decided to compile his detailed observations on weapons, tactics, and jungle warfare into a manuscript for his own records. A colleague who read it urged him to publish the work. Reluctantly, he agreed. The resulting book, a technical and unembellished account, became a respected classic among military historians and firearms experts, praised for its factual precision and lack of romanticism. It remains in print to this day as a valuable reference on World War II small arms and jungle tactics. Robert Miller lived a long life, witnessing the subsequent wars of the 20th century and the evolution of military sniper doctrine into a formal, respected specialty. He saw the lessons he had learned in bloodshed slowly being rediscovered and institutionalized. He passed away at the age of 90. His custom rifle was donated to a national museum, where it sits today in a display case. To most visitors, it appears as just another vintage hunting weapon. But its placard tells a brief version of its true story: how a championship shooter and his personally crafted rifle demonstrated the profound impact of precision marksmanship in modern warfare, fundamentally changing the U.S. military's approach to the sniper's role.